You know, I think in honor of Ellie, I have to start off this video review of The Last of Us with a few puns. So let's begin. What's a cannibal's favorite restaurant? Five Guys. Two cannibals were eating an entitled child, and one turned to the other and said, "Does this taste spoiled to you?" What do you call a war between two cannibals? A food fight. I'm sure Ellie would have appreciated those, but I'm sure I just lost subscribers, didn't I? Anyways, hello everybody and welcome to my review of the penultimate episode of the first season of The Last of Us. This one titled, I don't know, because yet again, HBO Max put the episode online right when it released without putting the episode title in there. I don't know why they do it. They're just, I don't know, the mad people over at HBO Max. I blame David Zaslav. He's a jerk anyways. I'll just put it on him. It's his fault that there's no title on this episode yet. Anyways, getting to the actual review here, I was really excited to see this section of the game adapted into TV because while there are sections in The Last of Us Part 2 that I actually would say are my favorite parts of The Last of Us franchise, this is easily my favorite section of the original Last of Us game. But even without that element of it, of this being the section of the game that I really like the most, I was even more intrigued to see what they were going to do with adapting this section because they don't have the same setup that the game has in terms of getting you into what this story is. For those of you who haven't played the game, and spoilers for the game, but if you've seen the episode, then you know the story. There's not much different in terms of the actual beats of the plot. But the main difference in the game is that the episode that we saw last week, where we sort of got Ellie's backstory and everything like that, was actually a section of the game that was in DLC that you played after the game was all over, sort of segmented off in its own separate thing. Whereas in the game, what actually happens is, right after Joel gets injured, where we saw in episode 6, it cuts to a few months ahead, and we just get to play as Ellie, and we actually don't know if Joel is alive or not for several more hours of gameplay. And that is where you encounter the character of David. And this is where the game, I think, is even more intriguing because I think this is the section of the original Last of Us game that I think most builds upon the fact that you are playing it as a game. I spoke way back in my review of the pilot episode of this show that I sort of thought that Last of Us was a really, easy adaptation, and easy being, kind of vague term, but an easy adaptation of a game to do because it is very cinematic in a lot of the story it's telling. Now, that's not exact one-to-one. There are sort of things that you could only tell in a game that have been changed for the show in interesting ways, but for the most part, it kind of is easy to adapt a lot of the stuff from The Last of Us into a TV show. But here, specifically, one of the elements of this section within the game is that when you encounter David, he becomes a sort of NPC player who starts to help you in the same way that Joel or Ellie was in the first part of the game. And as a result, you as the player start to become trusting of him a lot faster because you have an emotional, mechanical connection to him within the game. You have to rely on him to get through sections of fighting and gameplay within the story. And then that makes, when the reveal happens that he is, spoiler, though I guess the puns at the beginning of this video kind of spoil it a little bit, so apologies on that front. But when you get to the reveal that David is a cannibal, then you have a little bit more feeling of betrayal and surprise than I think you otherwise would have if you had not started to rely on him for the sections of the game that you have him there. Which makes for an interesting problem for this adaptation to solve, and I think it works to this episode's benefit and detriment in a little ways because they don't have that ability to make the audience trust David as immediately as quickly through the mechanics of the gameplay. And I think the show recognized this because David comes across a lot less immediately trustworthy or sympathetic as he does in the video game. Now, that's not to say that David isn't giving a grand performance. His scenes, especially his scenes with Ellie, and especially his first scene with Ellie, where they're sort of sitting around the deer, are fantastic. I love the back and forth, him sort of like getting to know her and sort of her slightly opening up to him a little bit, and then there's that twist at the end where he reveals like, oh, you killed one of my guys, but he's still sort of playing it as like worried about her or caring about her in his own warped, fucked up way. And I think that worked really well. I loved those scenes with him. I think the actor is playing him amazingly. But I also think that because the show recognized that David can't be immediately as trustworthy and you can't sort of get that subversion or twist that you would by staying in the perspective of Ellie, they sort of allow us to see his more kind of domineering nature throughout the rest of his, experiences with his own congregation, with his flock, I guess you would say. He sort of dominates the room, and how slowly he takes advantage of that and abuses his power over others. And he sort of frames it in this idea of caring, and they rely upon me, so I'm allowed to sort of take these liberties with power. And I like Ellie calling him out on that at one point. He's like, oh, they chose to follow me. They just had to. Which is clearly bullshit. And he believes that in some way, shape, or form because he has this sort of like, I'm a preacher, I am caring for these people, but he is just abusing his power and sort of framing it as love and caring, when really it's not. It's abusive and controlling. But he is so warped in his own head and in the heads of his followers that is the case, that they all have to trust him in this way. And so I think that, like, playing off of that and giving a slightly different dynamic, because we as the audience were never going to trust David as much, was, I think, a good choice for the character. One thing that I'm of two minds upon, but I'm leaning towards liking, but I could see someone not liking, is the just the fact that he is much more, one, physically abusive and sort of gaslighting and manipulative to his followers in a way that we don't see, I think, in the game. And then two, has a lot of, like, sexual overtones towards Ellie when he does capture her. I think is, again, there's a part of me that's always like, that is stuff that happens, so we should depict it, but I always sort of recoil at it, because I think sometimes seeing, like, characters, especially girls and female characters, and just to be clear, Bella Ramsey is non-binary, but Ellie is a female character in the story, that characters like that get placed into these situations a lot where they have to deal with sexual violence or sexual people coming on to them sexually. And so I'm sort of like, do we really need to go that route with Ellie? And also his physical abuse of some of his followers as well. That being said, I do think it fits the themes of the show really well, and I think it is really decently depicted, where he is sort of trying to play the, like, parental figure to Ellie, trying to give her gifts, kind of trying to, for lack of a better word, groom her into sort of becoming his, sexual object. Again, sorry having to be sort of dark about it, but that's what the show is going. And thankfully it doesn't go much deeper than, like, holding hands and the overtones of it. And I think that that's what makes it skirt the line for me as being a well done depiction of this, because we can see with his followers too, that when he, like, slaps the girl and then sort of helps her up, he is sort of, again, doing that gaslighting, emotionally manipulative behavior that you do see a lot in abusers, both physical or sexual abusers who have power over others. And I think it is well depicted without getting too terribly graphic, because in other shows it would get very graphic about sort of that, but here it is, not shying away from how awful it is, but it is not getting overly graphic with it, which if show in, like, The Last of Us, you would think they would, and I appreciated that restraint. And I also think these themes of how people can frame abusive relationships as love, I think is a pertinent one to this story. And I also really liked that David is the one that brought up the idea that cordyceps, when he's talking to Ellie, he's like, what is cordyceps? It loves, it's just trying to take care of itself. Because one of my big problems, and I having further conversations with some of my friends, I, like, had developed more thoughts on it that I haven't shared in some of the reviews. But going back to episode 2, if you listen to some of the commentary that some of the Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann said about the fact that the fungus was, like, kissing Tess, and there was sort of that awkward kiss moment between the two of them, and they're like, oh, the cordyceps loves itself, and it's trying to take care of itself, and I'm like, but is that love, though? It seems like a very controlling, like, if you're gonna put this sort of personification of love onto the cordyceps, it would be a much more abusive, toxic, harmful love. And the fact that David is the character that views it that way, sort of frames it from his perspective, that he views love in the same way that he thinks cordyceps is showing love, which is a very abusive, even sexual, overtony sort of way, again, as we see with the kiss that Tess is forced to do in episode 2. I don't know, I haven't listened to the commentary or podcast on this episode. I always listen to it afterwards so my reviews can be fresh. I'd be curious to hear what Craig and Neil in the Last of Us podcast, or the after credits thing that I watch after this, say about that aspect of it, because I wonder if they do sort of have a self-awareness of that, or they're still on the line of, like, the cordyceps loves itself. It would be interesting, because I'm like, I don't know if I agree disagree with their own reading of their own show, which I think is valid. I think people can disagree with the writers of their own show on their work. It's called interpretation of work, and I hope they would agree too. But anyways, I actually like that it came out of David's, for long and short. Other things that I really liked, there was just some small stuff throughout this episode that I really enjoyed, like the sort of building up of the reveal of the fact that they're cannibals. Like, for example, we have the human meat come out and they're cooking it, and someone asks, like, what is this? And they say venison. You think, oh, it must be the deer that Ellie shot that they're eating. But then the deer gets brought in immediately after. And so it's sort of like a, moment in your head. The only thing I would say about this episode, having sat with it more, is I think it could have really been 2 episodes. I think you could have had an episode that built up a bit more of this group and David's relationship with Ellie, and then have the subversion with, like, Joel coming after her. And I think that might have given a little bit more time to breathe, because it feels, even though the episode is paced slowly, I feel like the story itself moves along rather fast and doesn't allow it to hit as much as it does in the video game. But that's sort of my major critique of this. I do really like the idea of vengeance and sort of wanting to enact it, but, like, trying to hold people back from it that we see here. Also, shout out to Troy Baker in this, who is sort of David's second in command, James. Troy Baker is the actor who played Joel, Pedro Pascal's role in the video game. So it's just sort of funny to see him here. And Troy Baker is great. I love his acting. If you played any sort of narrative video game in the past 10, 20 years, you've come across Troy Baker. So he is great, and I think he does a solid job here. Not exactly a standout character, but just interesting to see him. I probably wouldn't note the character too much if Troy Baker hadn't been playing him, but it was a nice little cameo. The other thing too is I liked seeing both Ellie's and Joel's ruthlessness. And I like that the show didn't draw attention to this, but there is sort of a highlight between the violence that Joel and Ellie sort of enact around them in this episode. Justifiably so in some cases, sometimes overboard in others. Ellie, I think, is much more justifiable, pushing back against David, because fuck David and his abusive, manipulative ass. So when she bites him, that is a justifiable use of violence against him. But it also does speak to her being a much more violent person. Even David himself says, and I think that that's an accurate read, even coming from, a character like David. As we sort of seen in the last episode, she sort of reacts violently at these situations because she doesn't like a lack of control in her life. Understandably so, because she's been controlled her entire life, but she reacts to that by physical violence, because that's the way she can express herself. With Joel, though, it is mirrored in his character, where he enacts violence almost just too far. We are on Joel's side and understand why he does the torture against these 2 guys to get the information of where Ellie is. And so, again, I don't think torture is a thing that would really work in real life. Torture is bad, being very clear, but you understand why he's doing that. But then he just seems to, revel in murdering this guy needlessly and murdering his companion as well, when that didn't need to have been the case. So you sort of see how Joel goes way too far in his use of violence and how dark of a man he is through the experience that he's had over the past 20 years that we've seen hinted, and I like that we get it shown here. And while Ellie, again, is much more justifiable than him, we do sort of get sort of 2 sort of parallels in these 2 characters, and why they're much more related to each other and similar than maybe even both of them would care to admit. I think the only other change that I think might be, a lesser change for me, and maybe I'm misremembering, but one thing I remember from the game is that when Ellie kills David, Joel shows up and sees her over David's body and rescues her from there. And he clearly sees the trauma that she was going through and actually sort of cuts her off in the middle of this violence and tries to protect her from it. Whereas here, Joel comes in after Ellie has sort of left the building that she has murdered David in. And I hesitate to say it's a worse choice. It's an interesting one that I think immediately reads less powerful, as a less powerful choice than the games, but might actually end up being more powerful depending on what they do with it going down into the final episode of the season. If Joel's like trying to get information out of her, like what happened, what was it, what occurred, and she's closed off to him, as opposed to the Joel in the game being a little bit more in the know of what happened. I think it depends on how they play it next episode. But it reads immediately, my gut instinct coming out of it is, oh, that feels like a lesser choice. But they could do something more powerful with it down the road. Like I said, I didn't really do a beat-by-beat review like I normally do. This has been a long weekend. I had Emerald City Comic Con this weekend, and then also, if you didn't see, I had a big announcement live stream yesterday that was amazing and wonderful. I was honestly overwhelmed with so much joy and emotion from not only people that were on the stream, but all of you who may have attended it. And I announced that I'm doing a short film, and it's fully funded by Nebula, so that's amazing. And then I also filmed a video yesterday night because the only time the location I was filming at was available. Anyways, long story short, it's been a long weekend, so apologies if this was a little more of a rambly review than normal, but my brain is not exactly on a straight track at the moment. Though, then again, when is it ever on a straight anything? Anywho, that was my review of the penultimate episode of Season 1 of The Last of Us. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Beyond all of that, I love you all, my friends, and I hope you all live long and prosper.